And so let me start our panel with a question to all three of you. I'm interested in why you chose to study Boyle Heights.
My research doesn't specifically focus on Boyle Heights per se. Most of my work is on women in politics in Los Angeles, Mexican-American women and Chicanas, pre-Chicano movement, through the Chicano movement, and so obviously that ties into Boyle Heights because so much of the activism happened here in Boyle Heights, here at Roosevelt, in the surrounding communities, and so Boyle Heights is folded into my research, but it's not necessarily the only focus of it in that sense.
So it started in 2000 at a graduate seminar at Cal State Long Beach, and I took a class on the history of the suburbs, and we had to pick a research topic, and I picked a topic where I thought that not that many people had covered it, and that was specifically freeways around Boyle Heights.
When my parents came from Mexico, they came, the first place they landed was Boyle Heights in 1958. They lived on City View. And it was the first place I knew. And I think ever since then, I keep returning to Boyle Heights as a touchstone for my work. My first book, which started as my dissertation at Stanford, looked at the process of becoming Mexican American for Mexican immigrants in the early part of the 20th century. And I was doing basically all of East Los Angeles, but increasingly, for a lot of things, Boyle Heights kept complicating that history, and it kept complicating it because of the diversity of the community. I was trying to tell a story of Mexican immigrants, and popping up in the middle of the story would be Jews or Japanese or African Americans, and no matter what I did, I couldn't separate those folks, and so I kept returning to Boyle Heights. More recently, I'm writing a history of Boyle Heights and that interracial, but it's increasingly important for me to compare Boyle Heights to other multiracial communities. I've recently written about a comparison of Boyle Heights with parts of Hawaii and Cape Town, South Africa, particularly the District 6 area. And I think Boyle Heights speaks to the possibilities of a community of working class people who get along no matter whatever the diversity is. And I think we tend to have histories that are consistently only about conflict. And in Los Angeles, we know about that conflict, be it the Watts riots or the LA riots in '92. And we don't often go to the day-to-day lives that keep a community like Boyle Heights together, functioning, and moving forward. And so I'm struck by how often the issues that Boyle Heights face are issues that not only other communities in the United States face, but communities all over the world. And so for me, it's just a touchstone to understand much larger issues, and of course to see how this community will work out what are substantial problems at every point.
Why is Boyle Heights history of interest to people in other parts of the U.S.? And what is the importance of communities like Boyle Heights for our understanding of urban multicultural neighborhoods?
There's a lot of parts to that question depending on the time frame that we're talking about. Right now, of course, the way that Boyle Heights deals with gentrification is critical, and it's critical for Boyle Heights, but it's also critical for Chicago or New Orleans or Cape Town, South Africa. Can you have in a city undergoing this kind of change a working class neighborhood that can sustain itself, where there can be affordable housing, it can improve itself, but can still act as a place where businesses can happen from the community itself? These are real questions for Boyle Heights, yes, but for a lot of other communities. When you go back in time, you have issues of, can people, the question Rodney King asked in 1992 at the LA riots, can we get along? And I realized after my first book that, okay, that's a huge question. I mean, it's a simple question, but a huge question, but actually Boyle Heights gives a window into the answer to that question. When have people gotten along? When has there been conflict? That's why so many people are interested in this history of Boyle Heights, because it seems to go to over and over point to questions that the United States is dealing with, but that communities around the world are actually dealing with. Somehow the microcosm of Boyle Heights speaks to those issues on a fairly consistent basis.
I mean, it's really about the urban history, right? I mean, as someone who studies urban history, it is about how you create a city with either mass transit or with freeways, and the impacts of that in terms of health, like the type of cancers that you get. You can look at different cities like San Francisco that has getting rid of their freeways, or Manhattan, and like how they exist, how they brought in mass transit. And here we are again in Boyle Heights looking at people who don't see mass transit as a positive impact. Again, when you look at other urban places, they see it as the only way to get around. You go on dates on the mass transit, on the bus or something, and I know that sounds crazy to us, but people do things differently, and it's really how we, as Southern Californians or people from Boyle Heights, absolutely deal with that. And then the other thing is gentrification, and it's almost like the bad word that I don't want to say, because we don't have really long-term answer for that, you know. But as I pass the mic, you know, like I will say, I don't have the answer for gentrification, but really, I think like the better question is, what's the problem, or like what caused that? Is it capitalism? Right? I think that's a big part of it. I think it's the first time I'll say it's not just racism, it's capitalism that's actually first, then racism second, and a long, complicated history behind that. But other cities are dealing with the same thing as well.
I think what I'll add is that, at least from my perspective, Boyle Heights has such a long and rich history of political activism, both for Mexican Americans and Chicanas, but a whole coalition rooted in coalition building and coalition making, as we saw in the documentary, in terms of, if we look at the late 1940s and during the 1950s, and looking at how different ethnic and racial groups got along, right, as George was talking about, and how that really has a legacy in Boyle Heights that we see today, right? So it doesn't just come out of nowhere, all of these actions that are going on in light of gentrification, but also just thinking about education, just political representation and things like that. These have really deep roots here in Boyle Heights that are not just for Mexican Americans, but have these roots in coalition building and working across the lines and the boundaries that we now see that are so prevalent today.
Gilbert, I wondered if you could go back to the freeways and talk a little bit about like why there were so many built in Boyle Heights as opposed to other areas.
If you look at a map of Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles is the first urban major city to be circled by freeways. And the long story short, the plan was to bring outside traffic into the downtown business sector. Right? There's a lot of people wanting freeways downtown to bring up the downtown business. So East Los Angeles, by bad timing, by racism, by no political representation, by bad geography as well, was being the closest kind of place near downtown, really gets the brunt of all the progress that we have here in LA in the freeways. I think if you spend another couple of seconds on the map looking at the interchange, it's really like where that thing goes. And you really can put it in other places, because there are other places that have people that have more power, and the property values cost more, and it's another long, complicated history. So it's really the interchange, again, that is the linchpin of why there's so many freeways in Boyle Heights.
Gilbert mentioned progress. Boyle Heights has often been, I think, the experiment for city leaders looking for progress, and I use that in quotations. Progress sometimes means building an infrastructure for the rest of the city in Southern California, but sometimes it means moving people out. That may be the history of Mexican repatriation, but it was also the history of Japanese internment. Those things are linked, because the city leaders looking out go across the river and say, that's the place that we're going to experiment, that's the place that we're going to change, that's the place that's going to have public housing, then that's the place we're going to tear down the public housing and build something else. Consistently, Boyle Heights is the place that the city leaders experiment with. And so that has been all in the name of progress, and it's affected people in Boyle Heights pretty consistently and pretty negatively. So you had at the same time the political aspect of it, which is the people fighting that change, and sometimes winning, often losing those fights. After Roybal and the other people in CSO lost the battle against the freeways, they then had to fight for on and off ramps for people to use them from Boyle Heights. So I mean, it's a crazy process when you sort of think about it over time. And I think that's the closeness to downtown, which most people see as an advantage to Boyle Heights, and has also been its problem, which it's the first experimentation district for the city leaders.
Maricela, do you want to talk about the activism that happened after the freeways? So like in the late 50s, 60s, 70s?
There's a couple of stories that I think are relevant, and that speak to these kinds of, like Boyle Heights being this sort of hotbed of activism in many senses. And so, for example, in the early 1960s, a newsletter was founded, and the publishers published it on Soto. I have the address, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. And so it was called Carta Editorial, and it was published by two people, Francisca Flores and Delfino Varela. And both of them were longtime activists. Even prior to the 1960s, had been active in various community organizations and also in the Communist Party. And so both of them have really nice FBI files that you could look at. And so what they were looking at was city politics, not only city politics, but also regional and state and nationwide politics, and sometimes international politics. And it was just a little 3 to 5 page newsletter that they sent out from their office on Soto Street. And it really talked about all of the different issues that would affect it. So the Bracero program, communist McCarthyism, and the remnants of it in LA at that time. So the interesting thing about that newsletter is that Francisca Flores then ends up continuing her activism and ends up being one of the founders of an organization called the Comisión Femenil Mexicana Nacional, so the National Mexican Women's Commission. And that is founded in 1970, and lots of their meetings are held at the International Institute. And then as part of their own community building and the idea of women being economically independent, because they saw that as one of the main issues that women faced, especially Mexican American women and immigrant women as well, they opened the Chicana Service Action Center, also in Boyle Heights. The first offices were at the International Institute. And so I think that it's really interesting to see how certain institutions are lending themselves to be hosts of all of these different kinds of activism, activist groups, and eventually, Boyle Heights becomes even more enmeshed in all of the political activism of the Chicana movement. And so we see in the documentary the high school walkouts of 1968, which the 50th anniversary, I was trying to do the math in my head, and it worked. So is in March of next year, right? And so there will be lots of programming across the city to commemorate this event. And Roosevelt was one of the major places of this activism among students, and it's the one place that really got the brunt of the police brutality. Students being beaten by police, sheriffs, riot police coming in. And it's interesting that it's Roosevelt that gets this treatment. There's 5 schools in East Los Angeles that enact these walkouts that students organize with amongst themselves across schools, but also with college students in the area and other activist organizations of the time. And it's interesting to see that Roosevelt is the place that really gets hit the hardest in that sense with police action against the students. And so you have women who are also involved in that. So one of my favorite stories of that time, I'll stop after this story, is Vicky Castro, who becomes an LA school board member later on. I think it's in the 80s or the 90s. And she had already graduated from Roosevelt. And the story is that at one point, Roosevelt locked the gates so that students couldn't get out, right, to walk out of school during that those weeks of walkout, and she used her car to pull down the gate, right? So it's great, right? And it shows, I mean, it just shows the kind of bravery, I think, that people really exhibited during this time because of what they believed in or what they wanted to change in their educational system.
And you can see the activism throughout the history of the neighborhood, and we tried to really cover that in the film. We would like to open it up to questions from the audience.
First of all, I want to thank you very much for this film. In reading your study guide, I was so impressed with the people that put this film together. I'm getting emotional. My parents attended Roosevelt High School. I was born and raised in Memorial Hospital in Boyle Heights. And your film speaks true to my life and what I've experienced. My grandmother's from Querétaro, Mexico. My grandfather's from Kumamoto, Japan. And everything that you talked about is what I experienced growing up. I didn't know I was American because of World War II and my uncle being half Japanese, half Mexican, and having to serve and experience the discrimination that they did. When I speak about my history, where I grew up, one of my black girlfriends said, "Judy, why do you talk about East LA and my history?" And I said, "Because everything that you said, everybody's home that you went into spoke Russian, Japanese, Chinese, black food, wonderful food. I had food, and you heard the languages of every country and every, like you said in the film, one block, where all those different nationalities and cultures. And I feel very, very rich and fortunate to have been raised here." Thank you.
Thank you so much. That means the world to hear that from you. I really appreciate you sharing it.
I have a question. My name is Peter Benavides. I was born and raised in Boyle Heights, actually third generation Boyle Heights. I moved out twice, once to Northridge and once to Sierra Madre. And it feels like, I guess my question is for the Professor Sanchez, is progress a bad thing? Is there something wrong with wanting a Trader Joe's in Boyle Heights?
I don't think there's anything wrong with progress, but I think that when people from outside the community want Los Angeles to progress, and what they do is experiment in one neighborhood, Boyle Heights, that's a problem. So for example, on the freeways, there were supposed to be 3 freeways through Beverly Hills. Guess what? They never got built. So that's part of the reason why 5 freeways are in Boyle Heights. That's what progress has meant in Southern California. You experiment here. There was supposed to be public housing near UCLA. Guess what? It never got built. That's why there was 5 major public housing units built in Boyle Heights, because other places didn't build them, didn't want them. Right now, the reason that there's intense gentrification, what I mean by that is intense raising of rents for low-income people in Boyle Heights, is because other places in Los Angeles refuse to build enough housing. So young people growing up in the Valley or growing up in Santa Monica can't live in the neighborhood they grew up in. They can't afford it. So what do? I can live in Boyle Heights, raising the rents here because those neighborhoods have not built housing for their own young people. So what I mean by progress, in quotation marks, is that Boyle Heights bears the brunt of other communities saying, you know, we don't want that. We're going to protect ourselves. Let the change happen here. Let the transformation happen here. And that seriously affects quality of life here. And that's my problem with the way progress has been unfolding in Los Angeles for a very, very long time. There's nothing wrong with wanting a Trader Joe's. However, I think it's incredibly important that in Boyle Heights, what you've seen over time is people like Candela's Guitars, or El Tepayac, or Guisados, coming from people that grew up in this neighborhood and were able to open businesses. William Phillips, the Phillips Music Store for 50 years on Brooklyn, right? These were people that were from this neighborhood and were able to open up businesses in this neighborhood and become entrepreneurs. They didn't need a Trader Joe's, right? They didn't need a Walgreens. They didn't need other things. They could come. So when I see the eloteros, I see an entrepreneur. When I see the mariachis in Mariachi Plaza, I see entrepreneurs. They're trying to make a living for themselves. People that we should celebrate, people that go a long, long history of working class people who have made a life for themselves here in Boyle Heights. Some of whom ended up putting a business on Brooklyn or on First, right? This is a place you could do that in Los Angeles when you couldn't do it other places. That's the Los Angeles progress I don't want to lose. I don't want people who are smart, who want to build a life for themselves, immigrants and their children, have to leave this community to build a life for themselves. I want them to be able to stay, improve, build businesses. That's what I think progress really always has been in Boyle Heights, and that's what I want it to continue. If we lose that, we lose exactly why so many families have come to Boyle Heights, to progress, to sort of build. So that when I talk about that, that's what I'm talking about. Sustaining the very reason families have been attracted to Boyle Heights and have stayed and improved the neighborhood by their own actions over time.
Yet to build on that question, I think, when the freeways were built, it was considered progress. Nobody looked at the environmental implications of building this many freeways in a neighborhood and what was going to happen over time. It was what was considered progress. We show a little bit in the film of those old clips, so you can see how people were thinking in the 1950s.
It's a great question. I think the movie talked about like East Los Angeles specifically had over 100% of every planned freeway built, and then countywide in 2001 about only 61% of the freeway planned. I don't know how much time I got here, but I'll just be quick. Freeways don't work. Right? There's studies that when you actually widen freeways, you make traffic worse. They just opened up the 405. I widened. I forget how many millions of dollars it cost. It moves slower after the tens of millions of dollars. And I could cite different types of studies, but they don't work really well. The other thing too, like the 710 extension going into South Pasadena is hundreds of miles of freeways have been erased off freeway plans, like the Beverly Hills, like the Pacific Coast Freeway, and many other freeways where you actually kind of need more major corridors, but it's that small 6.1 mile corridor going to the South Pass has really, they put all their energy in that over the last 40 years. Like, if we just built that's going to solve the problem, right? If you take all the freeways, and so like, if you take all the streets, highways and freeways in SoCal, and you line them up, you can go to South America 9.8 times. So there's a lot of freeways in SoCal, and they want more, right? They don't think that it's enough, and if they just get a little more freeways, it'll fix the problem, and it really hasn't fixed anything. It's probably made things worse in terms of air quality. So keep up the good fight, right?
We don't have enough history of what public housing has brought positively to Boyle Heights in terms of political activism, and I think that's a real critical aspect. I think as those communities have changed, as Aliso Village has been kind of torn up into different things, as Riverwood is changing, you know, there's a lot of people who live in those places who care about them deeply. And a lot of the students here at Roosevelt, a couple years I worked on a project with teachers here who had their students talk about places of significance in their lives. And many of them are from Riverwood. And they talked beautifully about what it was like to live there and the community that they had there, and that they felt like that was going to be destroyed. So I think that's why I say it's a very complicated question, because you want those people to feel like they have a future in Boyle Heights. These are people who care deeply about the community. These are young people who want to stay. These are young people who want to invest. But if they have no options, if the lack of public housing, the destruction of that public housing leads them to no options in terms of housing in Boyle Heights, the community loses them. So I think that that's why it's a complicated question as we move forward. There's been a lot of changes, a lot of new theories about public housing. They've torn down some places, rebuilt in other ways. I have a feeling that's going to continue in Boyle Heights. I don't think there's one solution to how this is going to go. So we're going to see a continual change in terms of, sometimes some governments will privatize, others will bring it back public. I have a feeling that's going to be consistent, but that's what I meant by the experimentation in Boyle Heights. Is because of public housing, this is a place that government's going to experiment in, including in housing. What I would love to see is greater experimentation in the private housing stock in Boyle Heights. What do I mean by that? If you look at other cities that are gentrifying, let's say New Orleans, it has a very rich black jazz culture in the central city, and then went through Katrina. They've taken action to make sure they don't lose that culture in housing, to make sure that low-income artists can live in New Orleans. Otherwise, they lose what New Orleans is special and known for, right? And so they have low-income private housing for artists. One thing that's not covered in the film is Mexican repatriation. And it's an early story, but a very critical one, I think, for Boyle Heights, because it begins a process of ethnic removal. It leads directly, I think, to Japanese internment in the neighborhood. And what I mean by that is that Boyle Heights was targeted. Places in Boyle Heights was targeted. The Flats clearly was targeted as a place that welfare officials from LA County went into home by home and said, we want you to leave. And that process, the LA County Welfare Department also was the principal department that encouraged Japanese internment 12 years later. So these things are not separate. They're actually connected. It was the same welfare officials doing both. This actually the same people. So when people think about the multiracial history, it's not just the people that are connected, it's actually the government officials and the way in which they viewed Boyle Heights. And these days, when we're looking at students from Boyle Heights being targeted, families from Boyle Heights being targeted in terms of deportation, there's a long history that goes back to Mexican repatriation. And that's one area that I think is not in the film, but is very much part of a Boyle Heights history that needs to be discussed, needs to be talked about, and it's so relevant to the communities today.